we had done a similar study to this 10 years before, and it seemed that there was much more of a sense at that time that men were engaging in serosorting and actually, you know, looking at positive websites or only having sex with men who'd disclosed online that they were positive. But this seemed to us, and we need to do a little bit more quantitative investigation to find out about this, but it seems that it could be a diminishing practice in the UK. So, just as was the case with imperfect disclosure, men's attempts at serosorting were based on assumption rather than communication, often. A perfect example of this is in many men's accounts of being sure that all of the men that they encounter in sex clubs and bathhouses also have HIV. So, as one man said, well, I kind of make the assumption that when they're doing the kinds of things they're doing in that kind of setting, in a bathhouse, then they're obviously positive. It's just taken as read for me that they are. And what this man indicates, which was really a view shared by many bathhouse-using men in this sample, is that there is no need for cautious partner selection in bathhouses because everybody there must be positive, surely. Again, you know, as other authors have pointed out, and you know, if we think back to sort of Mary Douglas's work in this area, there's a real important role in terms of assessing the kind of risk that you might be involved with and assessing the extent to which the people around you are like you as a starting point for your assessment of that risk. If I'm here and I'm positive, and I probably got HIV when I was in a bathhouse, then they're probably all in the same boat as me. And you know, that's a means of establishing you know, having a sense and a predominant idea about the risk in the environment within which you live. So the implicit manner within which HIV awareness was handled in bathhouses also meant that these spaces provide an opportunity for men to switch off from the reality of their HIV status, at the same time as being able to feel that they were unlikely of actually exposing anybody to HIV that might actually put them at risk of a new HIV transmission. So, to simplify matters a little bit and to kind of round up what I'm saying, because you know, it's difficult. I've had to pluck out a number of themes that came out in the research report, which is much more coherent. To simplify things a little bit, I would say that men are aware that they pose a risk to others. They have the potential to cause harm to others, and that's a really big issue for them. That sort of initial issue about, you know, I know that my HIV could be transmitted to somebody and really seriously affect their life. So they respond to that harm as best they can. However, in doing so, by contemplating whether or not I'm going to disclose, or whether I'm, you know, going to only have sex with other HIV-positive men, or whether I'm never going to have sex again, or you know, whatever I see my choices to be, they recognize that in formulating that response, they might also then be introducing harms to themselves in various ways. They can face rejection if they disclose. They can face physical assault. There were certainly discussions about being assaulted following disclosure and supporting friends who were assaulted. It isn't necessarily always that men have experienced harm as a result of the sex that they have. They very, very often feared the extensive social and moral harm that they could undergo as a result of the kinds of responses that they might build to making sure that they didn't harm other people. They could have found other positive partners by attending to their serostatus, but many men in this sample felt that to do so abandoned any notion that they might fall in love, and that was a really painful thing to let go of. And so, you know, trying to respond to being a risk by only engaging in unprotected sex with people who are also HIV positive meant that I was throwing myself into that pile as well. And that represents to me a substantial amount of harm because I don't want to regard myself as being within that pile. So there were issues with all of the ways in which I might respond that then come back and in my mind reflect on me and change how I perceive myself. Of course, there were those in the sample who did seek to exclusively have sex with other men with diagnosed HIV, and they were okay with that. That was fine. And it didn't threaten their image of themselves, nor the meaning they attributed to sex. Likewise, there was a small proportion of men willing to disclose their status, even if it meant facing rejection and indeed experiencing rejection or not getting sex, because they felt it was the right thing to do. I'm not saying this is a totally homogenous group of people who are all behaving and reacting and perceiving in the same way. And in such cases, For those small groups of men, I would say their sense of moral integrity was strengthened by their sense of themselves and what they were doing, rather than weakened by the act of disclosure. And for whatever reason for them, it was working. And often they had a very strong social network. They'd been diagnosed with HIV for a considerably long number of years. They knew a lot of HIV positive men who provided them with a social system of support. The men who were not able to find a way of responding that worked for them were extremely isolated. It was interesting to me that even though they were introduced to our research study through local services, they were not accessing those services in much way at all. A lot of the psychosocial support that used to be offered through community-based services has been cut back dramatically, and you just got a sense that there was very little lack of connection, very little space in which men had a place where they could build up and talk about and consider what their options were and test those out with somebody by talking about it and considering it. And so, you know, they felt such relief by being in the interview because it was a place where they could explore and examine their own sense of risk. Because many men said, I've never been able to talk about this. There is no place that it is okay to have this conversation. I cannot have this conversation with my doctor. And I cannot have this conversation with other gay men because they would totally vilify me. That this is a problem. So this was something that came up very strongly. Again, you know, this is a pretty self-selecting group, and there'd be a lot more to look at around that, but that was something that kind of spoke to us. We were struck by the large proportion of respondents who described that they felt cold and calculating if they used any array of risk reduction strategies other than condoms. So it was like condoms or nothing. And these were often the kind of highly technical types of risk management tactics, like considering how infectious they might be, you know, off the radar, not an issue. And this research was undertaken after the Swiss statement came out about, you know, HIV and treatment as prevention, and the possibility that if you had a very well-managed viral load and no other STIs and were heterosexual, that HIV during unprotected sex might not be passed on. So there was discussion in the HIV sector a lot around that time in 2008 and leading into 2009 about that issue, and that was something that men in this study completely rejected in terms of risk management, which we thought was interesting. They didn't like the idea of who they might look like if they implemented risk reduction strategies that managed harm in what they regarded as a calculated way. They didn't want to see themselves as calculating. And so what they did in terms of managing a sort of sense of themselves was say, you know, I need to actually think about tactics that don't entirely eliminate risk, that don't bring harm to me and myself, and I can probably find a way that I can feel comfortable with that doesn't present a harm to me in terms of my moral sense, and maybe there's a way that I can kind of undertake a slightly deflective response. And so by that other arrow, what I sort of mean in terms of deflective responses is this whole notion of, you know, disclosure. I'm going to give that person enough information so that I can try and encourage them to think more plainly about the HIV risks that might be involved in this interaction, and leave it to them to make up their mind. Another type of deflective response that might help me avoid a little bit of the harm to myself is, you know, I'm going to go to bathhouses because that's a place where we don't really have to talk. Talking isn't really something that we do a whole lot of in bathhouses. I can pretty much be safe in my presumption that everybody there is HIV positive, so it should be okay. And you know, the whole notion of what it takes to do serosorting and how imperfect and flawed that can be is another part of that deflective response, which is kind of, you know, well, I'm pretty sure that the guys who are in this club in this particular place, they know the deal. I've seen that guy around a lot. You know, I'm sure he's been kicking around, and I've been seeing what he's been up to, so I'm sure he's positive too. You know, all of that kind of, all of those ways in which we put together a package of risk that builds our perception and helps us protect our sense of self, because that's important too. And we counterbalance that all the time with not wanting to harm other people, but also needing to protect ourselves in the meantime. And so, you know, what we found among a sizable number of men in this group was that basically they were trying to manage those harms, but they had very little support in doing so, and they had very little technical input or, you know, technical expertise to help them shine a light on, well, why would it be that you would assume that that, you know, that particular way of looking at the world actually reduces the risk to your partners? And what I'm kind of interested in, and I wanted to ask you, is that there doesn't seem to be a theory that I've come across yet that incorporates a dualistic risk perception or risk position, being a subject who is at the one and the same time at risk, but also is posing risk to other people. And I'm interested in kind of considering if we have the theoretical tools to consider how within one person risk resides both. I can pose a risk to you, and also there's a whole range of risks that you can project at me at the same time, and I'm managing both sides of that risk. Presenting men, I would say, as health promotion interventions often do, with a range of risk management tools was abhorrent for many of the men with HIV in this study, because it meant that they had to become risk calculators. And that meant that a diagnosed man would have to estimate how comfortable he was with potentially posing a risk of infection to others. And that was regarded as unacceptable, because it requires him to confront the other that is actually within himself. And almost all men taking part in this research did not want to be associated with that other HIV positive man that they really sort of put over there. There was a real notion that those men make all of us look really bad, and I need to maintain that distance, which obviously takes us right back to Mary Douglas and pollution and purity and all that stuff. What we're finding is that rather than eliminating or managing risk in a direct sense, many of the men in this sample find themselves very much in an in-between place with regards to the risk they are at themselves and the risks that they pose to others. And this is a very imperfect way of trying to discuss that, but I thought it might stimulate some of our discussion afterwards. So that's the end of the talk. I just want to point out that at the website, which is of course the green bar on the top, if you go there and you navigate across the toolbars to the research stream of gay men's research that we do, and it also falls under the stream of research with people living with HIV, you can find the full report. The full report was called Relative Safety 2. And certainly you can email me if you have any problems finding that. The other thing you can do as well, I brought along a handout that just kind of describes briefly what we do and directs you to our website, so I can give those to you as well. So that's it. Thanks very much.